Okay, in this video I want to talk about species and natural selection. So let me start off with species. Now, what's a species? Okay, here's the definition of a species. It's basically the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals of that species of appropriate sexes can produce offspring, typically by sexual reproduction. Okay, so they're parts of a group, individuals part of a group, defined as a species. Speciation is a word you should know as well. Speciation is the process by which one species splits into two or more separate ones. Okay, the splitting of a species. And speciation has resulted in what's called biodiversity. Okay, what's biodiversity? It's the number and the range, so number and range of different species that exist. Just think of the word diversity. Diversity means different things. Bio, different diversity in life. Now, speciation, as I mentioned, results in biodiversity and all the species that have appeared in the past. Okay, and there are 3 steps in speciation, how it can occur. Okay, first step is variation. Second step is isolation. Third step is selection, and I'll talk about these on the next piece of paper. Okay, number 1, variation. Let me expand on this. What's variation? Well, the word says it all. Okay, must exist. So the species must exist in a population. Well, otherwise, speciation can't occur. Okay, so different types of species exist in population. Variation. Number 2, isolation. Basically, the formation of new species, okay, requires isolation. Okay, if they're separated from one another on different islands, if they become separated eventually, they evolve into different species. Okay, that means that different groups of population are prevented by some mechanism from interbreeding, okay, from having offspring. It prevents gene flow throughout the population too, and it stops any differences in one population from reaching the other. So that's isolation. Number 3, selection. Okay, once isolated, okay, this could be by barriers, physical barriers. Natural selection affects the genotypes, okay, the different types of possibilities, and causes changes that prevents the groups from breeding, even if they come back together again at some point in the future. Okay. For example, chemical barriers. There's physical barriers, but there's also chemical barriers. So chemical barriers, where sperm, let's say, male sperm, may be killed by the chemistry, the biochemistry, the chemical structure of the female. Okay. So fertilization may not occur. The chemical barriers. So let me now talk about natural selection. Natural selection, okay. Basically a process, so it's the process in which the environment, the word says it all basically, environment selects favorable characteristics. Okay, by reducing the frequency of unfavorable characteristics, such that after many generations the species will become better adapted to the environment. Okay, so organisms have special features, okay, called adaptations. Features called adaptations. It's an important word you should know, that enable them enable them to survive in specific environments. Okay, the process by which a species becomes fitted to its environment. Okay, that's adaptation. There are different types of adaptation. There's structured adaptations. Okay, these are physical features. So structured, think of structure, think of limbs, physical features of an organism. Okay, think of, here are some examples. Fur on a bear. Okay, that's a physical feature. Another example is the bill on a bird. Okay, that's structural adaptations. There's also behavioral adaptations. And you guessed it, comes from its behavior. Okay, they're basically things an organism does to survive. Okay, behavioral wise, psychologically. Okay, an example is a bird calling. Okay, bird calls. Another example is migration. Okay, so birds following other birds. And adaptations, I should mention, adaptations are the result of evolution. It's the take-home message. So what are the sources of variations in species? Okay, here they are, genes, mutations, and the environment. These are three sources of variations. These are three things that can change a species, okay? Differences in genes, okay, result in differences in characteristics. Environmental selection, remember? Okay, the environment selects the desirable characteristics. And now genetic variation can be caused by mutation, remember? Mutations, they can create entirely new alleles in a population, okay? Now variation is important in the environment. Sorry, it's very important, variation is very important because it results in a species being able to survive, okay? So variation is important because it allows for species to survive. Okay, that's why it's important. So the survival of a species relies on at least some individuals producing offspring. Okay, you need to keep producing offspring in a species for it to survive. Once it stops, it's finished. The organisms that are best adapted to the environment are the most likely to produce offspring. Okay, and some individuals will have characteristics that are favorable, okay, allowing the species to survive the change. So let me write down here, organisms best adapted to their environment are the most likely to produce offspring. Okay, now natural selection is a process where an environmental factor acts on a population, okay, and results in some organisms having more offspring than others. So equals process where an environmental factor, it's worth committing this to memory, environmental factor acts on a population and results in some organisms having more offspring than others, okay, so being more successful, as I mentioned before. Okay, the environmental factor that acts on population is known as, this is important as well to know, a selective agent. Okay, think of a scenario where you've got a special agent in the Secret Service, goes to someone in the public and selects them to be an agent. Okay, think of that as selective agent. Okay, it can be biotic. It can be a biotic factor. Biotic, remember, it means living, so it could be from another living thing. So, for example, from bacterial infections, could come from this. It could be a predator like a falcon. It could be an abiotic factor. Abiotic means not living. Abiotic factor like physical factor like temperature and water. A predator like a falcon going after a rat or something. Okay, it's natural selection.